way. It's such a short-sighted management approach.
Yeah, I think when you look at it, when you have, it's almost what we were talking about earlier when you said there's a chink in the armor, and that opens the way for just kind of rampant corruption. I think what's happened to the city is there was a chink in the armor at some point, and the system started to get corrupt, where we started to get assessors, property assessors who were doing corrupt things. You had people who were on the inside of the city, the council, the police department, the chief of police. All these different kinds of people started to figure out how they could game the system to their best advantage, and to hell with the consequences. And I think as that ball starts rolling, if you don't have a strong check on it, if the police department doesn't have internal investigations, if there isn't an outside force that's checking the police, watchers watching the watchmen, if you will, then what you get is rampant and unchecked corruption to the point where you end up with something like Chicago, which if you talk to the residents of Chicago, they complain all the time about how corrupt it is, how corrupt the institution is as a whole, how corrupt the people who are leading the city. And then if you start looking at the results of that corruption, you get very angry, and the people of the city get very, very angry.
Well, I see the people getting angry about it. I see people getting angry about it here. I read it in the Star Tribune all the time. The comments are incredible. But it wouldn't surprise me if the mayor still walked away with a large majority. How do you explain that?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who don't realize the consequences of their actions and think that they can achieve a different result by doing the same things over and over.
You're talking about the voters?
Voters. Yeah. Well, the voters are ultimately in control. They are. Yeah. Even though it may not feel like it, your vote still does count. Every vote counts. It's going to matter who you get out there and vote for. If you vote for the status quo, you're going to get the status quo. Essentially what you're saying is, I'm voting to say that I like what's being done, especially if you're voting party lines. There's been one party that's been in control of this city, and it's very similar in Chicago. There's been one party that's been in control of Minneapolis and Chicago for the last many, many years, at least 30 to 40 years. And if you continue to do that exact same thing, you're going to get the exact same results.
Well, maybe it's another conversation to have as to why people keep voting for a party or for a, and I even want to, because this isn't to say that all DFL endorsed candidates are not good politicians, but it seems like there's a momentum that is being led by DFL candidates that has been completely responsible for the city and for the corruption and the police force and the council. The indictments. We might have a third indictment coming up or at least a verdict that awards a developer a lot of money, millions of dollars, because of a council person's misdeeds. Is that a word? Misdeeds?
I think so.
Bad behavior. But anyway, maybe I'll have a psychologist in to talk about that sometime. Let's talk a little bit about housing. The other issue that you sort of talked about, you talked about the police and the problems there, and you talked about your interest in being a council person because of housing. There's, I'll just reiterate what you said earlier about how, we had property values going up, the market was just going up, so the city was collecting all this revenue, and, maybe this would be I don't know, so what do you argue? That this is a point of mismanagement where the council during the 2002 to 2006, when the housing prices were going up through the roof, they should have been planning for a rainy day.
Government, even though people like to joke about it and say that they aren't, government is staffed with intelligent people. These intelligent people are there for whatever reasons they're there, but it was no surprise to a lot of people that there was a housing bubble going on. It's easy to spot a bubble. Watch wherever you see really rapid growth or unsustainable rates of growth, and you've got a bubble. That's all there is to it. 2008, I talked about how the bubble was well predicted by a lot of different people. And I think you can look at another place where there's a bubble forming, and that's in the dollar. There's no reason why, after we've printed all this money, that the dollar should still retain its value. Essentially, if you double the amount of stuff in circulation and the thing that's in circulation stays the same value, then it's all doubled in value overnight.
Right.
I mean, so it's an unsustainable growth, and it's ready for a collapse. It's going to happen, just like the bubble in housing was going to happen. So for the city council to say, wow, what a surprise, you know, we would never have known that there was a bubble forming. Well, that's ridiculous. Of course they should have been planning for a rainy day. They should have been more actively planning and managing the city and saying, look, these property values are unsustainable. They're not going to continue to grow like this. We have to keep our funds under control, and so we should be lowering property taxes while property values are going up. Essentially, we should be able to run the city at you know, a static cost as long as we're covering inflation. And we were seeing 7 to 9% growth. Well, that's, you know, we can argue about whether that's above inflation or not, but I mean, that's a huge run-up in the amount of revenues being collected. So exactly what got more expensive in the city? Oh, well, perhaps we should start looking at some of the things. Maybe it's because we spend $500,000 on decorative drinking fountains, or we spend $350,000 on a feasibility study on whether we should bring back streetcars or not. You know, these kinds of things are what you spend money on when you feel you have money to burn. And I think that's what the city council started to do. They just rampantly started spending money. Now we find ourselves in 2009, LGA gets cut, budget looks like a big, like there's a big gap, and Ryback comes back and he says, well, we're going to need to have an 11 to 16% hike in property taxes to offset these losses.
And blames the governor.
And blames the governor.
Yeah.
And yet, well, what did the city council do with all that money? Well, you know, maybe that ought to be one of the first places we start looking, because I think the whole time the big bubble was happening and there were all this extra revenues, that's the time where you lower taxes and you keep things tight. Then if, you know, you start to find yourself in a different situation, you can make adjustments. But if you've ran up the percentages as high as you possibly can and now you find yourself where you need more money, you basically have no room to go anywhere. You can't do anything. You're stuck. You're completely stuck. I think people would be much more accepting of tax increases if you have to do it, if you've just been lowering them for the last 10 years and you're like, hey, you know, LGA got cut and property values have gone down and all this, you know, we're going to raise taxes by 1%. They're like, oh, okay, well, you know, 1%.
Yeah.
That's good management. That is how you manage a city, and that is the evidence of good management. So we can look at what the city's done, and we can just look at their budget and show, well, that's evidence of mismanagement. It's absolutely. It's like you can just look at it and say, look, they're not managing it. Same thing. You can look at the Minneapolis public school system. We can look at their budgets. You can look at just look at the delta between what they predict, what's in their budget, and what they actually spend. If you just look at the spread, you can say, well, they obviously don't know what they're doing. Because if they say they're going to spend $500,000 on something, what's like a reasonable amount to be off? 10% maybe? But you look at it and they'll say they're going to spend $500,000 on something, and they're off by like 3x, $1.5 million you'll see is their actual. That is not budgeting. That is just guessing. I could do as well by throwing darts at a dartboard.
Grant, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Brandon, thanks
really
for having me.
Appreciated having you on.
And look forward to all the voters coming out in November. Vote for change, overthrow the status quo.
November 3rd, there won't be as many that came out as there were last November, but, you know, that means your vote means more this time around. So come on out and make your voice heard. And thanks a lot for viewing today's show, and we'll see you next time. Bye.